Good morning and welcome to American Government here with Mr. Boyd. This is Chapter 13, the Presidency. We're going to look at the executive branch slightly. Mostly we're going to focus on the president and their qualifications, roles, who fills in succession, and look at the importance of that position in the United States government. Let's move on to the next slide here. Just want to reiterate, please feel free to pause at any time and review anything that I'm talking about that you didn't quite pick up. I would also suggest taking notes as you go through the process. Okay, and here are the objectives for the President's job description. Section 1, we're going to look at what are the President's many roles. What are the formal qualifications necessary to become President of the United States? What issues have risen involving the length of the President's term? And how is the President compensated? So let's look at those 8 roles first as the President. We'll go through a slide of 4, another slide of 4, and then I'll give you an acronym here at the end to put it all together. So if you don't get things right away, don't panic. It will come shortly and help you figure it all out. Think of yourself and who you live with, who you hang out with, where you work, where you go to school. There are some roles that you play. You're probably someone's brother or sister. You're somebody's son or daughter. You are someone's employee. You fulfill the role of the student. And each time you fit into one of these roles, you may act a little differently. Your vocabulary might be different. Your thought process might be a little bit different. I know the way you probably treat your siblings, this way of communicating with them is different than the way you treat your friends, or different than how you would talk to your bosses compared to maybe talk to your parents. So I just want you to think about those roles that you have as we move into the 8 president roles. So the first one here is the Chief of State, and that's the president as the leader of our country. There is no greater position in a country than to be in the head of the state. Now, again, just a reminder, state meaning country and not like the state of Oregon, Washington, or Idaho. So you, as the president, would be the ceremonial figurehead of the United States government. You are the symbol of the entire nation. When people look to the United States and they see the president, what the president is doing, how they're acting, how they're talking, that is what people perceive the United States to be. That's what it means to be Chief of State. The next one is the Chief Executive. So as the leader of the executive branch of the government, the president has executive power over the United States. So very much like the CEO of a company, where you get to make all the tough decisions on what to buy, what to sell, the president of the United States makes those tough decisions on what laws to enforce, what new laws to get Congress to create, how you're going to deal with immigration, how are you going to deal with issues when there's a disaster, when do we let FEMA come in, when do we not let FEMA come in. So these are some really big decisions that fit with that executive power of the president, and as chief executive, they make those decisions. The next one is the Chief Administrator. This might sound a little bit like the executive branch. The difference here, as the chief administrator, the president is in charge of the United States government. So as chief executive, the president is going to be in charge of making executive decisions about the country, and chief administrator, the president's making decisions about how the federal government works. And remember, we talk about federal government, it could also be known as the national government, the United States government. This is that in the world of federalism, this is that one central government, and the president is in charge of that. There's over 2 million people that work for the federal government in non-military capacity. So this is a lot of folks that the president is in charge of, and he's going to be ultimately telling them what to do. Obviously, with that many people working, there's a hierarchy system, so he's not making like day-to-day decisions of how much it's going to cost to go into a national park. He would have someone else do that, but ultimately the president's responsible for making sure that the United States government does run efficiently. The next one is the Chief Diplomat. And as the chief diplomat, the president says here, the main architect of American foreign policy. So what that means is, how do we treat other nations? How do we work with other nations? Who are we going to be friends with? Who are we going to be enemies with? Who are we going to potentially go to war with? As the chief diplomat, the president is working with these other nations and creating a network to support countries around the world, to put sanctions on other countries. Currently, we're dealing with North Korea. And the United States government, as chief diplomat, the president has said we are going to impose greater sanctions on North Korea and get them to stop any type of nuclear production of weapons that they may or may not be doing. And it will remain to be seen here if this is going to work out for the president or not. But it's definitely a great example of how the president is taking on the role of chief diplomat and changing a policy that was in place in the previous administration. So those are the first four. Let's look at the next four. We have the Commander-in-Chief. We have talked about this one a lot in class. As Commander-in-Chief, the President is in charge of the nation's armed forces. The President has a group called the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and this group is made up of the top generals of all of the military branches, and they meet with the President on a regular basis to discuss how the military is going to be or not be used in dealing with some of those other roles that we talked about with the President at this point. Ultimately, the President's in charge of the military, the nation's armed forces. The next one is Chief Legislator. And as we saw with the State of the Union address, the President will go to Congress and say, these are the things that I would like to see done. One of them is building the wall in the southern border of the United States. Oh, little brief interruption there, apologize. So the Chief Legislator, as the President of the United States, tells Congress what things need to be done. As I was saying, the wall in the southern border is something that the President has asked for. He's asked for tax reform. He's currently talking about gun legislation. So he's creating these issues that he can't just solve on his own. He has to get Congress to pass laws that are basically dealing with the topics that he's talking about. Those laws are called public policies, and as he tells Congress these are the things that need to be done, he is basically the chief legislator. He also, as a chief legislator, as we know, it has the power of the veto and signs all pieces of legislation into law. We've talked before about not signing in the pocket veto, but that final step in every piece of legislation passing by the president's desk is something that is extremely important. And in the checks and balances system, as a chief legislator, this is a role that the president has and he deals with on a daily basis. Our next one is the chief of party. So as the president of the United States, he or she is the most well-known figure of their political party. And as President Trump is a Republican, he is in charge of the Republican Party. He will take this position and use it to try to strengthen the party, typically, try to keep the party together, try to advance party platforms, as we've talked about before, that they put together at their conventions. They're doing all this party work together to try to strengthen their party so that they can win the next election and keep that party in power. And the last role is chief citizen. And this is kind of one of our newer ones that's kind of really been added to the presidency more so in the later part of the 20th century. But the president's basically expected to be a representative of all the people. So as a chief citizen, we would expect the president to live like more or less the perfect citizen, making sure that they're making good decisions, they're treating others appropriately, and kind of like the chief of state representing what it is to be an American. And there's no actual blueprint or law or written requirement for chief citizen, or really for any of these, is for the most part. But the chief citizen is kind of a feeling or a customary tag that we put on the president to make sure that they're being respectful and they're someone that we're proud of in office. So if you look at all 8 of these, we've come up with an acronym. Hold on. Sorry, I think I've got my slides backwards. So here's the 8 roles of the president, and we call the acronym PLACE CDs. And we have chief of party, chief legislator, chief administrator, commander-in-chief, chief executive, chief citizen, chief diplomat, and chief of state. So you will need to know these 8 roles the president has and has to deal with on a daily basis. And we're talking from the time the president wakes up in the morning, might see a briefing right away from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and have to be the commander-in-chief and roll right into the chief executive. Maybe dealing with an issue overseas as the chief diplomat, or meet with, like the Boy Scouts come to visit the president and he is going to take a picture with him. That's acting as the chief of state. So these things are happening on a daily basis for the president. The president isn't really setting the agenda. The chief of staff, which is a close personal confidant of the president's, a non-elected person that the president appoints to help kind of be the filter and create the schedule for the president on a daily basis, so that the 8 roles don't just get smudged all over the place, and the president is able to fulfill those and make the most of their day. Now we're going to back up here a slide and look at qualifications for president now. Very similar to what we've talked about before. These are the ones that are written out in the Constitution. We looked at representatives and senators, and you'll see that the president is very similar. Number 1, they must be a natural-born citizen. That means they have to have been born a citizen of the United States. They don't have to be born on United States soil. They could be born on a military base overseas and still be considered a U.S. citizen. But for the most part, we want people that have been born in the United States on United States soil, just to make it clear. But it's not an absolute, but they do need to be a natural, what's called a natural born citizen. Number 2, they have to be at least 35 years of age. John F. Kennedy was the youngest president elected at age 43. Teddy Roosevelt was the youngest president ever at age 42, but he was a vice president who then became president when the president passed away. We'll talk about that more a little bit later. Number 3, they have to have lived in the United States for 14 years. The reason for 14 years, we declared independence in 1776, and 14 years later is when we created the Constitution and became the United States. So they said, look, you have to be someone who's lived in the United States for that period of time. There are some informal qualifications that, just like looking at members of Congress, it helps if you're white, it helps if you're male, it helps if you're educated, it helps if you have a name and you're well known throughout the U.S. It helps if you can project intelligence and character. But those are not requirements. You don't have to have money. It definitely helps to have money. But those are things that you do not necessarily have to be president. And we're going to skip that slide again. All right, so let's look at the president's term. Prior to 1951, there were no term limits. I think we've talked about this a little bit before. President Roosevelt's election to his 4th term really changed the thought process here, as it was accustomed to step down after 2. And if you remember, we talked about George Washington setting that precedent as the first president of the United States. So here again, this statement here is just talking about FDR breaking the tradition of stepping down after 2 terms. And that put into place the 22nd Amendment, which limits the presidents to 2 terms. It's the only limitation that there is at the national government level. As Congress, none of those members are currently having term limits. The way to remember this one is a president can serve 2 terms, and if you look at the 2 and 22nd, there's 2 2s there. So just put all those numbers together, and you've got 2 terms to be President of the United States. And let's look at how much the president gets paid and what are some of the benefits. So president does not get paid very much. $400,000 a year is probably, for some of our past couple of presidents, is like a Christmas bonus. To them it's not an enormous amount of money that you and I would maybe look at $400,000 a year. But there is some compensation for being president. The president has to pay taxes on that income. I believe President Trump has publicly stated that he is not going to collect the paycheck from the national government, save the federal government $400,000 a year. Some other things that the president has, they have an expense account where they can use up to $50,000 a year. They typically will spend money to do some makeovers in the White House, add some different things to make their stay at the White House much more enjoyable for themselves. There's some other major benefits. Obviously, there's 132 rooms in the White House. Every president has added something. Bill Clinton put in a track. Obama had a basketball court. George Bush had a weight room put in. There's been a swimming pool in the White House before, a bowling alley, putting greens, all kinds of different recreational pieces for presidents to get out and recreate a little bit to alleviate some of the stress of being the president of the United States. The president also has some other really nice benefits like Air Force One, which there are actually two 747s that will carry the name Air Force One, and actually any plane that the president steps on is considered Air Force One, and they just use their regular FAA call signs prior to that. So the president has a plane, and when he steps on it, it's called Air Force One. It has everything on it from his own little apartment up in the front. It has seating for the press pool, all of the 40 reporters that follow the president wherever he or she goes for the most part. And it has a doctor on board. It has all kinds of little military evasive action pieces to protect itself. It has the same brains on board that the president could use with military staff to run the entire military while they're aloft. The president also has a yacht that is stationed in Baltimore. The president has his own helicopter. He's got his own motorcade. He has his own, hold on here just a second, has his own retreat location called Camp David up in the hills of western Baltimore. And you know, these things are set up for the president to use at his disposal to try to communicate, intimidate, invite foreign dignitaries, other guests in. Jimmy Carter used Camp David to create a peace accords in the Middle East in the 70s. These options are here for the president to really show the rest of the world that this person is extremely powerful, and you want to listen to him, and you want to be on our side. You don't want to go against the United States. Let's just kind of ask a couple questions here of you and see if you can come up with some answers. So, as Commander-in-Chief, the President is A, the leader of all the nation's armed forces, B, initiates legislation, C, is the director of the government, or D, represents the citizens of the United States abroad. Now, all four of these are actually roles of the president, but as leader of the armed forces, A, he is the commander-in-chief. So let's look at number 2 here. In order to become president, a citizen needs to be at least, is it 25, 35, 45, or 30 years old? If you guessed B, 35 years old, you are correct. Moving on to section 2. Let's look at presidential succession and the vice presidency. So how does the Constitution provide for presidential succession? And these are objectives we're going through now. What are the constitutional provisions for presidential disability? What is the role of the vice president? And don't worry about that little one on the bottom there. We'll fill it in here in just a second. Okay, here we go. I move myself off to the side just for a moment. Okay, great. So the Constitution provides for presidential succession, and it didn't originally do anything for presidential succession. It just said that the vice president had 2 duties: one, to break ties and rule in the Senate, and number 2 was to fulfill the role of president if the president was unable to fulfill those actions. And even that was not made very clear in the Constitution. So the 25th Amendment, which was ratified in 1967, and this is after we've had several vice presidents step into the role of the presidency, made it extremely clear what is going to happen. If the president at any time becomes unable to fulfill the duties, this could be going to the dentist and being put out and have the wisdom teeth taken out. You know, you're out for an hour. The vice president would step in and be the president. If the president and vice president are both unable to fulfill the duties, the Speaker of the House would be the person, and then so on down the list, all the way to the very end here. Number 18 is the Secretary of Homeland Security, which would be the last person that would fulfill these roles. So when we watched the State of the Union here a couple of weeks ago, the president was there, the vice president was there, the Speaker of the House, and the President pro tempore of the Senate were all there. One of these secretaries, from Secretary of State all the way through the Secretary of Homeland Security, was designated as the quote-unquote designated survivor, which meant they did not go to the Capitol building that day because most of the government was there. And if something were to happen, we needed somebody to be able to run our federal government if there was some type of disaster. So one of these people or two of these people would potentially stay out and then would fulfill those roles. Always making sure that in the grimmest of cases that we do have some type of leadership for our country. And moving on. So let's look at presidential disability. I think I will come back into the screen here. And as we said before, we talked about the 25th Amendment. Talks about the vice president becoming the president if the president informs Congress in writing that he or she is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. So whatever it may be, the president can say, hey, look, I'm unable to do this. So someone needs to take over, which would be the vice president. And the next piece there is if the vice president, majority of the cabinet members, and those were the 18 people that were, sorry, the 15 people, numbers 3 through 18 that were listed previously, if they, in writing, agree that the president is unable to perform his duties, they can inform Congress, and then the president can be removed. So there's a movie out there called Air Force One, actually, and it talks about a president who was, his Air Force One was hijacked, and he loses basically control of being able to be the president because he's being held hostage by some terrorists. So can he or can he not fulfill the duties as president? And this would be an example of a potential real-world example that the government was planned for. And then at that point, Congress could step in and remove the power of the president, give it to the vice president based on the vote of the cabinet and the vice president. Okay. I'm going to move myself back down here again. All right, so the Constitution only gives the vice president 2 duties, as I mentioned before. Number 1, they have to preside over the Senate. That means they're going to break ties and kind of keep order, very much like our President pro tempore was doing. And number 2, they help decide the question of presidential disability, meaning if the president's unable to fulfill the duties as president. If the office of the president becomes vacant, then the president nominates vice president subject to congressional approval. So this happened in the early 70s. Spiro Agnew was the vice president of the United States, and Richard M. Nixon basically asked the vice president to resign amid some scandal with tax evasion. And so Spiro Agnew resigned. The president then picked the current Speaker of the House, which was Gerald Ford, said, be my president. Congress approved, and Gerald Ford became the next vice president. Now, we all know that the president, Nixon, then resigned shortly thereafter that, and Gerald Ford became president of the United States without ever being elected to the executive branch, and was president for 2 years and then lost the election to Jimmy Carter. So today, it's a little bit different with the vice president, as you've seen with Vice President Pence and Joe Biden, Vice President Joe Biden in the previous administration, where they're really involved in the day-to-day operations, very much like a cabinet member. They're not just kind of left out there to just kind of sit. In fact, the first 200 years, 150 years of our existence, the vice president was the worst possible position from political activists, because they didn't do anything. They just basically sat in the Senate, and they were only involved if they were breaking ties, and they just waited for the president to die. And so it wasn't a lot for them to do, but they've been incorporated much more so as of late. So looking here at vice presidents who have become presidents because the president that they were under had passed away. And if John Tyler was the first vice president to become president, Henry Harrison was part of the Tippecanoe Tyler II ticket back in the 1840 election. And Henry Harrison is the president who gave a 3-hour speech in sub-zero temperatures in Washington, D.C., caught pneumonia, and died shortly after becoming president of the United States. So John Tyler comes into office barely 30 days in and says, I'm the vice president, I'm taking over, and the cabinet member said, oh, no, you're not, we're going to pick somebody else. It doesn't say in the Constitution that you get to be president, it just says you fulfill the role, so we're going to have another election. And they obviously politically disagreed with each other a little bit. John Tyler fired all the cabinet members, and there was a big Supreme Court case that dealt with that. But what this all boils down to is that John Tyler, who was listed as the vice president, fulfilled the duties of president and really set the standard through custom that the vice president will become president if the president should pass on. And if you look through a list here, we from 1841 up to even 1923, 1901, we had quite a few presidents that passed away in office. So it wasn't a very uncommon thing for a president to lose their life and become dead, for lack of a better term, and then the vice president to take over. Again, the youngest sitting president was Theodore Roosevelt. He was 42 at the time, and that was because McKinley was shot, assassinated, and died shortly thereafter. Calvin Coolidge died of an illness, and we have Truman, who took over. Calvin Coolidge took over for Harding, who died of illness. Truman took over for FDR, and Lyndon Johnson took over for Kennedy, and then Gerald Ford, as I mentioned earlier, the only president who was never elected on a ticket and running for president initially. Now, looking at all those lists of vice presidents, you guys are not going to need to know all those people. I just wanted to give you a little bit of history so you kind of understand where the vice presidency is coming from. Okay, so who's in line for presidential succession following the vice president? Well, the First Lady, the Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate, or the Secretary of State. So after the Vice President, one way to think about this is we want a government official. Think back to 6 basic principles. We want a government official that is more closely connected to the people really than anybody else. And the members of the House of Representatives only are elected for 2 years. They represent a smaller group of people, but they're in constant communication because they're always up for election. So that's why they've chosen the Speaker of the House to be the third person in line, because they're connected to the people. All right, which constitutional amendment provides for presidential succession? Well, the 22nd Amendment was the one that was the 2 terms because it's 2-2, and so let's go to the 25th. That is correct. 25th Amendment is the one that provides for presidential succession. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about the election. We've talked about this back when we were doing our political behavior section, so some of this should be just review, so I'll run through it fairly quickly. The function of the Electoral College, we're going to look at, briefly look at maybe some flaws. We're going to skip the advantages and disadvantages. But just so when we look at the Electoral College today, we know that all the states are in a winner-take-all situation. Whoever wins the popular vote gets all the state's electors. The electors are chosen by the parties in each state, whichever presidential candidate is chosen by the voters, that party's electors will then vote for the president. And then on the Monday after the second Wednesday in December, those electors cast their vote for president. Remember, the actual popular election is in November, following the first Tuesday following the first Monday. On January 6th, the electoral votes are counted by the president of the Senate, so is the vice president, and the president and vice president are formally elected at that point. If no candidate has the 270 of the 538 electoral votes, then the House of Representatives will do the voting, and that becomes, basically you're looking at 1 vote per state. It's not all 435 members get a vote, and so they do that a little bit differently. That has happened once before, and that was prior to the 12th Amendment, which changed the way the Electoral College works. Ever since then, we've had someone get the 270, or the majority. Okay, so there are a couple flaws in the Electoral College, obviously, and we can add in here to 2016 that the popular vote getter has not won the presidency. There's nothing in the federal statutes, federal laws that require the electors to select the popular vote person in the state. They do it because they're really closely tied to their party. We've talked about that before. And we've looked at if no candidate gains that majority, what I was just talking about, 1800 and 1824, then it goes into the House of Representatives. Okay, again, you guys, we're just reviewing that, so don't get hung up on that information at this point. All right. There's a couple proposed reforms. We're just going to touch on these really briefly. You won't need to know these for the quiz. There's a district plan, which would basically you get an elector for each district in your state. So Oregon would have those 5, and then 2 for the entire state, and they could vote separately. So it's split up by district, not split up by state. Then we have the direct popular election, just getting rid of the electoral college altogether and vote in the president like we do everybody else. A proportional plan would allow states to, if you were 75% Republican and 25% Democrat, then you would get 75% of the electoral votes in your state, and 25% would go to the Democratic Party. The national bonus plan, which is very much just like the electoral college, except for whoever won the national popular election would get 102 electoral votes on top of what they already had, and then that would increase the number they're needing to win or get to that 270 would increase that number, but it would almost guarantee that any national popular vote winner would win the election. Okay, again, I just wanted you guys to know that in case someone wanted to talk to you about it, but it's not going to be on the quiz. Some positive things about the Electoral College is that it really helps to bring the states together. These smaller states that don't have a lot of population, because people are going to go to those states to win. It allows us to define who, or to determine who the president is going to be fairly quickly as well. All right, so that's the end of our video. Look to the Google Classroom questions that will be associated with the executive branch, and if you can get those done, that would be fantastic. On Thursday, we'll touch on any issues or questions that you might have with the executive branch. I'll give you a couple of bits of information about the judicial branch, and that will pretty much wrap us up and get us ready to go for quiz on Friday, and then next week we're looking at our final. Hope you had a good day, and I will see you tomorrow.